We've got one more or two. Welcome to the first Multimodal Freight Task Force. That's a mouthful. Before calling the row, I'd like to welcome all of you all to the first meeting. And also, I'd like to remind members to silence their cell phones if they don't mind. And that's a reminder for myself. And today's meeting, all the materials are currently available in the special committee meeting page on the LRC website. Also, we want to thank Ashley and Christina and John and the rest of our staff from LRC. They do a lot of our work for us, as most all of you all know. And I'll also ask my my co-chair if he has anything that he wants to go ahead and say to start.
No, just echoing what you said, Madam Chairman, and thanks to everyone that's been involved in this and working. Jeremy, thanks for putting all this together, Secretary Knoll, and I appreciate everybody being here and digging into this issue.
Okay, Secretary, please call the roll.
Senator Chambers Armstrong.
Here.
Senator Higdon.
Here.
Senator Storm. Senator Turner.
Here.
Representative Blanton.
Here.
Representative Freeland.
Here.
Representative Smith.
Here.
Representative Tackett Lafferty. Co-Chair Howell.
Here.
Chairwoman Miles.
Here. Thank you all for being here today. We have our first person already ready to go. I think he was at the previous meeting, and so I think he is all set. Jeremy Edgeworth, would you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us what your title is, and please proceed.
Okay. My name is Jeremy Edgeworth. I'm the Freight, Rail, and Waterways Coordinator for the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. And I was asked to present on Kentucky's recent river ports, highway, and rail freight analysis study. Ms. Williams wanted me to note that I added a couple slides in my presentation and that she will upload that to the website after the presentation.
Thank you.
So the Kentucky River Ports, move this forward. The Kentucky River Ports, highway, and rail freight analysis study began in 2002. The study assessed the waterborne commerce markets for Kentucky, the river port's current state, and potential future directions for river port investment in the Commonwealth. These activities have provided an understanding of today's waterborne commerce markets, the role of public river ports in future economic development, and the potential benefits of investing in Kentucky's public river port infrastructure. The Transportation Cabinet did not undertake this important study independently. In addition to our consulting team, we had a wide range of local, state, and federal partners advising us on the study. And now it should be noted that despite the involvement of several state agencies, this report and recommendations do not represent an official position of the Transportation Cabinet or of the administration. So to provide some geographical context about our study, Kentucky has 1,662 miles of inland waterways, 1,020 of which are commercially navigable, which ranks us fourth in the nation. Kentucky is surrounded on three sides by the commercially navigable rivers of the Mississippi, Ohio, and the Big Sandy River, and we also have the Tennessee, Cumberland, Green, and Licking rivers able to move freight. Kentucky's geographic location provides us great advantages in being at the center of a vast inland waterway network and at the confluence of several critical inland waterway routes. Kentucky's waterways are supported by 10 public river ports, 7 are active ports, and 3 ports are at different stages of development. They range in size from smaller agricultural hubs providing fertilizer and gathering the grain of the local farmers to large players in the world aluminum markets being listed on the London Metal Exchange. They move heavy steel coils on and off the river for manufacturing and provide warehousing and distribution. These ports provide critical connections moving goods on and off of our rivers. Kentucky's public river ports are supplemented by over 160 private river terminals. These are privately owned terminals that provide many of the same services as our public river ports, moving goods on and off the rivers, but are often developed for a single commodity. To help move freight on and off of our waterways, our public ports and private terminals connect to a network of over 2,600 miles of rail throughout Kentucky. Kentucky serves as an important hub connecting 5 Class 1 railroads in the western part of the state, while a network of Class 2 and Class 3 railroads fill in the gaps to efficiently move freight within our state. Our rail network provides access to the greater markets outside of Kentucky to places like Chicago, New Orleans, and the ports on the East Coast. The first and last mile connection of our state's freight network rests on our public road network. Kentucky has over 80,000 public road miles and provides those critical first and last mile connections. And while our public and private ports can reach into the large population centers of the eastern portion of the United States using this road network, often the impact of our public and private ports is more regional. We refer to this as the Riverport hinterlands. These are all the counties that can be reached within a 90-minute drive of our public ports. The reach and the benefits of our public river ports extend throughout much of Kentucky, as well as into neighboring Tennessee, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia. So while every community may not be adjacent to a river or have a river port, all of Kentucky benefits from the efficiency of waterborne transportation. One 15-barge tow and towboat, which is commonly seen working our inland waterway network, moves the freight equivalent of 6 locomotives and 216 rail cars. This same 15-barge tow moves equivalent of over 1,050 large semis and tractor trailers. Looking specifically at the freight moved in Kentucky in 2018, 89 million tons of freight, valued at $18 billion, moved on Kentucky's inland waterways. This would be the equivalent of adding 3.5 million trucks annually to our roadway network without the contribution of our waterways. And about 79% of Kentucky's waterborne trade by tonnage is exchanged with trading partners outside of the Commonwealth. Our waterways and public and private ports support more than just the riverborne commerce. The jet fuel that powers the U.S. hubs for DHL, UPS, and Amazon Prime Air are all delivered by barge. Manufactured at the Marathon Catlettsburg refinery, the jet fuel is transported down the Ohio River to Cincinnati. Pipelines then deliver the fuel to the Cincinnati airport, which is the U.S. hub for DHL and the new hub for Amazon Prime Air. The jet fuel then travels further down the Ohio River to Louisville, where pipelines deliver the jet fuel to the Louisville airport, which is the worldwide air hub for UPS. So what were some of the things we learned from our study? Our river ports connect Kentucky to the nation and to the world through our inland waterway system. The river ports represent an opportunity to affordably move a significant tonnage of inexpensive freight across a wide range of commodities. While the market for waterborne coal is declining in Kentucky, other commodities are growing, with newly locating businesses in Kentucky representing potential future markets for public river ports. As noted, in 2018, 89 million tons of freight valued at $18 billion moved on Kentucky's inland waterways. Approximately 19% of Kentucky's freight tonnage moves by water, but this only makes up 3% of the value. This is largely due to the nature of the commodities moved. Waterways tend to move heavier yet less valuable cargo due to the lower cost to move the goods by water. The top inland waterway commodities moved by weight were coal, lignite, and coal coke, sand, gravel, shells, clay, salt and slag, and petroleum products. By value, the top inland waterway commodities were basic chemicals used in consumer products, including appliances, toys, and cosmetics, as well as gasoline and coal. Finally, Kentucky is bordered by states that share access to the same inner waterway systems. These states compete with us for customers, tenants, federal funding, and their port facilities are sometimes just minutes across the river from ours. Overall, Kentucky's long-standing waterborne commerce markets in coal, fossil fuels, and minerals have declined at a rate faster than the nation as a whole. Moreover, these waterborne commerce markets are projected in the future to shift even more away from these long-standing commodities. The changes highlight the importance of modernizing Kentucky's public river ports to compete for new and more diverse markets. Plastics, rubber, and chemicals, as well as food and livestock, are growing markets for waterborne commerce in Kentucky. While these markets are smaller than today's mineral and fossil fuel markets, they are rapidly growing, and public river ports are already working to keep up with this growth. Waterborne trade in plastics, rubber, textiles, and machinery increased 11 times from 1997 to 2017, and from 2018 to 2045, it is projected that waterborne trade in chemicals and allied products such as plastics, rubber, and similar goods will increase by 23%. It is also projected that from 2018 to 2045, Kentucky's waterborne trade in food and kindred products will increase by 144%, and its trade in agricultural and livestock products will increase by 81%. So there are opportunities for our ports, but it is going to require collaborative effort to best position the ports to attract and grow these new markets. One critical component of the study was the assessment of the public port infrastructure and identifying their needs. The study identified that in 2020, Kentucky's river ports had a $12.3 million backlog in unmet needs to simply get the existing infrastructure into a state of good repair and continue business as normal. The ports also identified additional modernization and expansion needs to successfully compete for business and serve new markets in the long term. To upgrade our ports that were constructed in the 1960s and 1970s to modern operational efficiency, the study found would require an additional $51.6 million, and to upgrade the public river ports to attract new markets and expand capacity would require an additional $158 million. All told, the 2020 total investment needs the study identified was $222 million, and with current inflation, these figures would probably be much higher. The study recommended a one-time injection of funds to allow the ports to address the most pressing preservation needs, followed by a dedicated stream of funding to address ongoing preservation, but also the ability to use state funds to match available federal funds to modernize and expand. Several of our public ports have been successful at receiving federal grants to preserve their existing infrastructure, but often the local match is a hindrance to applicants. Kentucky today faces a critical choice of whether to invest in modernizing the public river ports and their capacity to handle a new and increasingly diverse market, or see waterborne commerce play less of a role in Kentucky's economy. Kentucky is also able to choose the degree to which its business attraction and economic development strategies will play a role in building the markets for highly efficient waterborne transportation. But investing in public river ports will create benefits to Kentucky's economy far exceeding the costs. Kentucky's ports, inland waterways, and inland waterway dependent industries currently support nearly 110,000 jobs. This equates to $5.9 billion in personal income, $12 billion in gross state product, and $30.7 billion in total output. This gives rise to more than $1.2 billion in state and local tax revenue. As noted previously, Kentucky is bordered by states that share access to the same inland waterway systems. These states compete with us for customers, tenants, federal funding, and their port facilities are sometimes just minutes across the river from ours. These states provide financial assistance to their public ports to maintain and upgrade their facilities and infrastructure to retain long-standing tenants and attract new users. Ohio's Maritime Assistance Grant Program was just increased by their legislature from $12 million annually to over $20 million annually. Missouri annually allocates $12 million in state funds for their public river ports, but they recently infused an additional $30 million in their ARPA funds for their ports. Illinois' annual grant program for their public ports totals $150 million, with $40 million alone dedicated to building a new port in Cairo, Illinois, which is very close to our Paducah River Port. The final Riverport study materials include a 200-page report, a 12-page executive summary, and a 4-page brochure of the main study. We also have a marketing toolkit to guide the ports in their marketing efforts, as well as PowerPoint presentations about the role of a port. There are also 4 technical memorandum as well as port profiles of all of our public ports. These materials have all been posted on the Cabinet's website and can be accessed via this link or using this QR code. So the presentation provided a summary of inland waterway systems as well as some of the findings and recommendations of the Riverports Highway and Rail Freight Analysis Study. But it should be noted this report and the recommendations do not represent official position of the Transportation Cabinet or the administration or an official budgetary request. I believe the Kentucky Better Transportation and the Kentucky Association of Riverports are working on specific funding request amounts. I would like to add a note about Kentucky's freight plan. This is a federal requirement of all states. Our prior freight plan was approved by the Federal Highway Administration in 2017 with a 5-year update cycle. With the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, this update cycle was shortened to 4 years and added some new required content. Kentucky was already in the process of updating our state freight plan when the bipartisan infrastructure law requirements came out, and so we were able to adjust our freight plan submission to be bipartisan infrastructure law compliant. So the Kentucky Freight Plan was officially approved by the Federal Highway Administration on May 3rd of 2023. The freight plan includes an inventory of multimodal freight networks, including highways, waterways, rail, pipelines, and air cargo. It looked at goals and performance measures, current conditions, key industries and supply chains, freight trends and challenges, freight system needs, policy and strategic recommendations, and most importantly, a freight investment plan. Not to be left out, we are also updating our Kentucky statewide rail plan. Last completed in 2015, this update will bring our rail plan into compliance with the Federal Railroad Administration's updated guidelines for a state rail plan. This update mainly focuses on an inventory of the state rail system, passenger and freight rail facilities, rail tonnages, available funding, and rail safety and security. We've partnered with our Kentucky's railroads to expand the scope of our rail plan to update to include a more thorough look at rail infrastructure needs, rail bottlenecks and connectivity, rail bridge conditions, rail line preservation needs, and etc. This expanded and updated rail plan will help our railroads as they seek federal grant opportunities to improve their infrastructure by having their needs reflected in the state's rail plan. The notice to proceed was just issued on June 17th of this year, so the statewide rail plan infrastructure assessment is just commencing with an 18-month expected completion. So information on our Kentucky Riverports Highway and Rail Freight Analysis Study, the Kentucky Freight Plan, or our Kentucky Statewide Rail Plan and Infrastructure Assessment can all be found on our freight planning website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. Co-Chair Howell, do you have any questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, just a couple. Jeremy, thanks for your time on this. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I just want to go back through a couple of things. A lot of the data that comes from this it's derived and we keep up with because of we have to constantly update our federal plans, right? So,
That's correct.
So that touches all the arenas of what we're looking at in here. Does it do anything with air cargo? Do we have to keep up with that? I was trying to follow it, and you were going pretty fast, and I'm from Western Kentucky, and we speak pretty slowly, so I was in trouble there for a minute.
Our freight plan does look at air cargo. It looks at the volumes. It does not look at suggestions for improving or increasing air cargo. Our Department of Aviation handles aviation separately. I deal with cargo and freight generally, but that is one area I don't get a lot into is aviation.
Kind of the floor for a couple more, Madam Chair. So you were talking, I want to go back and revisit, you were talking, the slides aren't numbered, I apologize. It's the economic impact slide with 110,000 jobs, personal income, that sort of thing. In context of that, you were talking about investments that other surrounding states had made. Ohio, I believe you mentioned Ohio, Missouri,
Correct.
And Illinois in particular. Can you go back and revisit those numbers
Sure.
on what they had invested?
Sure.
Because that's not on the slide. I see it here. So those investments, what's the timeline for those investments? Has that just been in the last year, 2 years?
I believe Missouri's has been longstanding, but the injection of ARPA funds was a new addition to their funding levels. Ohio, theirs kind of ramped up within the past 5 or 6 years. They started at, I believe, $10 million, and then they went to 12. And in the past legislative session, they went up to $20 million. Illinois, I believe they have always had a decent amount of funding for their ports, but right now they've got $150 million, and they've dedicated 40 or allocated 40 for a new port in Cairo, Illinois.
I'm guessing we probably don't, but do we happen to have any data for how much they'd invested in the past, if this is an ongoing investment or if these are kind of one-time dollars in the moment for some of these ports?
I can go back and look. That's not information I have currently with me, but I can go back and look.
Sure, I'm not trying.
Yeah, sure.
There would have been no reason for you to have that other than knowing I wanted to ask the question. And then, along with that, do we have any data on some of the economic development that builds up around some of these invested ports?
I mean, all of our ports are economic engines.
I'm talking about in the other states.
In other states, I don't know that I have that information. That I don't think our study looked at that. I mean, that's more probably the Economic Development Cabinet more so than me.
I believe that's all I have right now. Thanks.
Representative Blanton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe I missed this. So we're putting in $500,000 annually. They're putting in the smallest amount I'm seeing up there is $12 million annually before ARCAS. What's the difference in the outcome and our lack of funding compared to Missouri, Ohio, and Illinois? What are they producing economically?
That would not be. I could not answer that question because I don't have that information.
One would have to assume that they're probably producing more, right?
I would assume they're producing more, and they're probably able to bring in, this is my assumption, they're probably able to bring in different tenants because they're able to have different infrastructure, newer infrastructure at their ports.
Right.
Any other questions for Jeremy? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chair. In this study, did you have any reason to look into customs offices, the foreign trade, or bringing in foreign trade or delivery?
We did not, but several of our public ports are foreign trade zones or they operate as subzones. So several of our ports do operate as foreign trade zones.
Having that status, though, they don't immediately have customs status, have customs offices for clearance?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Chamber Armstrong.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a question. I am not super familiar with river ports, and when you talk about more modern infrastructure and being able to recruit new tenants, could you give me an idea of what that actually means? Because one of the asks was for, I think, $122 million to build out this infrastructure that will help businesses presumably come and locate there. Could you just give me a flavor of what that is and what that means sort of on the ground?
from a generic perspective, a lot of tenants, when they're looking at locating the river ports, they now have increased demands for water supply. They have different demands for internet connectivity that a lot of the ports don't have. And so, for instance, like the Eddyville River Port just did a huge project to help bring better internet into their port so they can help bring in different tenants. So as the tenants are coming in, they have different needs than they did when these ports were built in the 60s and 70s. Some of these ports, when they were built, were designed for coal. Well, those commodities have moved to different commodities now, and some of the newer commodities may be liquid fertilizers that require tank farms. Well, the ports may not have those, so they need to build those tank farms to be able to move those commodities. So over time, some of the infrastructure has just fallen into disrepair, but then over time, some of the commodities have changed that the ports want to focus on, and they don't have the infrastructure handling capabilities at the port to do that.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Co-Chair Howell.
Yeah, I have one other question. You had mentioned in one of your earlier slides about the private river ports in Kentucky, and there are quite a few of them, as I recall. Can you kind of just, as much as you know, again, not trying to put you on,
Sure.
on a deep dive spot or anything, can you just kind of build out some about the areas of need that some of the private ports satisfy in our river system?
A lot of the private ports are set up more for single commodities, so it may be they move just coal, they may move just grain for that company, and so if I was to show up with a load of grain, they may not be able to help me with my commodity because they only serve their company. That's the advantage to the public river ports, is they serve anybody that comes in with a need to move goods. They're generally able to help do that. Our private terminals, which we estimate is about 160 throughout Kentucky, they help fill in that niche. But like I said, often they're for a specific company or a specific commodity, and they may not be able to help address, all the needs of freight moving through Kentucky.
Do you know if most of those are in the bulk arena, grains, coal, aggregate, that sort of thing?
I don't know that I don't know that I have seen a breakdown of how they all are. I know just anecdotally what I've seen up and down the river from the different terminals that are there, that a lot of them handle grain, a lot of them handle coal. Whether they're actually moving other commodities, I'm not really sure.
So just for the sake of clarity for the committee, if Bungie has granary on a river and there's not even anything else around it, we're counting that as a private port for our purposes for this?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time going into this.
Any other questions from the committee? Thank you, Jeremy, and please thank Secretary Gray for the information also, and thanks for bringing Kenny Bishop with you. I know he's a friend to the LRC, and we're trying to keep him awake in the audience today, so nice to have him. Next, we would like to welcome up Secretary Jeff Knoll and his Deputy Secretary, Katie Smith, and also his counsel, Matthew Wynn. So please join us. Please identify yourself and then proceed.
I always forget what button to push. My name is Jeff Nolan. I'm Secretary of the Cabinet for Economic Development. Thank you for allowing us to be here today.
Good afternoon. I'm Katie Smith. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet.
Good afternoon. Matt Wingate. I'm the General Counsel for the Cabinet.
Senator Howe, Chairman, Co-Chairman, and other members of this committee, I'm going to plow through a lot of slides because I'm trying to avoid Jeremy. You did a great job, buddy. You're now a part of our team. We're going to have you work with us on some of these things going forward. But if I can go to the next slide. What we thought we would do is just pontificate a little bit on what we do in our cabinet, how it fits in with river ports and multimodal forms of transportation, and talk a little bit about what we're doing to make sure that, in my humble opinion, we take care of the assets that we have, and we do. We try to improve them, and we also try to look forward to improving the state's economy in so many different ways, because multimodal transportation is oftentimes misunderstood in that there may be folks using different modes of transportation, but they're actually getting a price advantage because there are other modes of transportation. Sometimes you've got companies that got different kinds of products that would use those different types of modes of transportation. And I think really at the end of the day, it's the interdependencies that come along with those that we as a state have a lot of advantages when you realize it could be the air freight, it could be the rail, it could be the river, all those things come into play. But at the end of the day, I don't care what kind of company you are in, you're looking for, and according to Deloitte in a recent study, the top issues that companies today are looking relative to where they're going to invest is first supply chain. And the second is workforce. We all know that. The third one's interesting in that it gets into risk management, but then also site reliance, but overall cost environment. Supply chain, risk management in terms of getting your goods and services on time. I know when I worked at Whirlpool during COVID, our refrigerator went down. I chose, and our leadership chose, not to get new appliances because we wanted to take care of our customers. After 5 months, my wife started reminding me or asking me, I thought you worked for an appliance company. I can tell you that interdependency and that supply chain, if it goes down, your whole business is completely disrupted. So supply chain, risk management, and overall cost environment all play critical factors, and multimodal transportation plays in each and every one of those in terms of the decision a company would make. And let me just say, cost environment is oftentimes driven by if a company is reliant upon certain modes of transportation, or they use another mode to leverage the best price point in terms of their contracts. They look to the state level of support in that environment to basically rank us if they're going to be looking at an expansion or relocation decision. We also wanted to say how much we appreciate this body taking this topic up. I think it's critically important for our core industries, which are a real focal point for us at the Cabinet for Economic Development. But we also know that we all need to be working together in this area, primarily because this is a lot of moving parts. And a lot of things are happening in the world today in this area. Just as an example, I mean, a lot of eyes are on rail and rail transport relative to safety, relative to some things that have occurred. We know that water transportation, as Jeremy mentioned, the types of products that are being used are shifting and changing, and we need to be aware of that. Relative to trucking, policies are having an impact in terms of trying to take trucks off the roads, inability to find the workforce. All of these interdependencies are kind of driving, I think, decisions that need to be made about multimodal forms of transportation. And I think we all look forward to working together to also define not just the input items that need to be done, but the outputs that go along with them, and really looking at those cost benefits. It can include how do you reduce that wear and tear on our roads and our systems that you all help make sure they get funded in the right way. If we can take some trucks off of those roads and reduce that wear and tear and really maximize our rail and other multi-modes of transportation. And so for us, we think we need to work together to help prioritize where we would put our energies and resources, make sure there is a direct payback, that it can be measured. And also I want to compliment the entire legislative body, because we feel the creation and the work through House Bill 9 in terms of really looking at federal funding is another one of those tools that we ought to be leveraging and working together around to make sure we get all the federal funding that could be available to help all of our multimodal forms of transportation, including our rail. I know many of you have seen this before. It's our proverbial one-pager at the Cabinet for Economic Development. But if you look at the strategic imperatives, we are in the middle of doing a strategic roadmap for our Cabinet, but also for the kinds of industries that we are trying to attract and recruit. That goes directly to the things Jeremy mentioned in terms of the kinds of companies that we want to bring in to take advantage of our natural advantages through the water, rail, you name it, and we know we need to do that. Over on the other corner is our targeted industries that will be studied as part of this effort to look at our strategy. And again, I think we can find the types of industries that hit our sweet spot, and that by locating them in our state or helping them expand, they also help utilize our assets, which is our multimodal forms of transportation. This slide to me is always important because at our Cabinet, we believe very strongly, let's take care of our core industries. Our core industries are really what drives this state. And as I like to say, when you work with your core industries, they move to expand beyond the core. Sometimes they go way beyond the core, and I like to say what's happening in the EV industry is simply a transformation of one of our core industry segments, and all of these core industry segments do rely upon multimodal forms of transportation. I think we should work together. We need to work with the Transportation Committee to understand what are the issues around multimodal transportation, what are the ways in which we can influence some of those areas, and what are the needs of our industries across the state, because we are heavily dependent in a good way upon the automotive sector here in the state of Kentucky, and understanding what's happening with our existing supply chain and those interdependencies with surrounding states, I think is an important step for our Cabinet, the Transportation Cabinet, and this body to work together on. We have a lot of abundant resources. I think we're very fortunate to have these kinds of core industries, and I always like to say in these industries, when you're talking about multimodal, it's not just an inbound service delivery. It's got to be inbound and outbound. You got to have that right balance in order to make that system work appropriately. And we're very fortunate that our metals industries are very critical in terms of use of our river ports, in terms of our rail, especially not just bringing in raw material goods, but in bringing those recycled metals necessary to operate the way they do. Nucor happens to be the world's largest recycler of metals. They have several facilities in Kentucky. North American Stainless brings in recycled items to operate their business, and they employ thousands of people across Kentucky. But more importantly, they help service a lot of our existing businesses. And as I found out last evening, trying to talk to a prospect, they help us attract new companies. But it always comes back to what's going to be the supply chain? How do we move goods and services from one item to the other? Kentucky happens to be the nation's leader when you think about per capita basis of foreign direct investment. I think this is an excellent resource to understand the dispersity of these companies throughout Kentucky, where are they located next and near our multimodal forms of transportation, and I think we can learn more from them what their future holds, what their needs are going to be, and candidly, as transformation continues to take place, in spite of some of the changes I'm mentioning earlier about rail, water, you name it, I think understanding that is one of the opportunities we have as we start to answer the questions, what is the future of multimodal transportation in Kentucky? What are the right areas we should prioritize? And what's that right payback that we need? And how do we leverage funding out there to attract those things? This slide is only meant to say we have a lot of new companies that have yet to even become operational. We understand where they are using the multimodal forms of transportation. I think we have to do a better job of understanding what if one of those modes were to no longer be really feasible in Kentucky? What would happen to those other modes that they rely upon relative to pricing and reliability? Two big factors that also go into running these businesses. I mentioned the EV industry only because I like to say that if it's part of, whether I agree with it or not, the current administration's policy, then if this is a national policy area and we're leading the charge relative to these investments and there is a need for multimodal forms of transportation, it only goes to logic, using House Bill 9 and working together, let's go after the type of federal funds that can be part of that investment in those multimodal areas from a transportation perspective, business attraction, business growth perspective, you name it. Jeremy knows more about this than I ever could, but I think a definition of multimodal transportation and the benefits to Kentucky are important. Again, back to COVID, the congestions that took place in our major ports, it really changed the whole supply chain dynamics. Representative Smith, I think you were asking a question about foreign trade zones and whether there's actually customs officials. We should think big and decide for ourselves. Can we bring some of those things into Kentucky? Can we get more customs officials in some of our multimodal areas? That would only relieve congestion that currently exists in those ports. And there's other reasons why companies take advantage of it, both from a pricing perspective. There's also, I think, some security perspectives that when you move on rail, you have higher levels of security relative to the goods and items that you're moving. Lots of reasons companies look at differing forms of multimodal transportation, and the trends are much more in using 2 or 3 different modes to ultimately get your goods to where you're going to make something and then out there to ultimately to your customer. Understanding all that, building that into the equation, I think will help us all make better collective decisions going forward. We thought it was important to also look at just some of the basic definitions, and it goes to the data. There is a reason why some of the volumes are so high, but the value may not be as high, because when you're moving basically high freight volume, it's a logical choice to look at differing modes of transportation, especially rail and water. If you're 700 miles or more, I think it's important that rail factors in. Also, short line rails become a critical factor in terms of that supply chain for business. And I go back to also, if you're shipping high value freight, there's security benefits, there's also record keeping benefits. And I think we have to understand that, as Jeremy mentioned, because that includes investments in digital services, investments in the kind of security and ancillary roads that fully help us take what I would call the full advantage of the power of multimodal transportation as it relates to attracting businesses. Lots of things are happening in the industry today. We know that, but also as you think about this, every time there is one movement, there can be an unintended consequence, or hopefully better yet, an intended consequence. Investing in our river ports, investing in our rail services, that's also going to help stimulate more warehousing, more production, more what I call bringing suppliers into our area, and all that's got to be factored in to our decision-making process as we put these things together. My favorite slide is a little bit of a reality check. There's states that are investing in their river ports. I've gotten to know quite a few of the operators of our public river ports. I happened to know some of them before I left Kentucky. We got really good operators, and I think that's one of the advantages that we have, because every state, every community will try to say, hey, we've got unique advantages in supply chains. Well, the reality check is multimodal is the way you keep that in checks and balances. If one state really is heavily dependent upon truck traffic, as an example, they're more susceptible to the peaks and valleys, and companies are really looking for longer-term stability in that pricing in the form of transportation. And again, back to that decision-making, I do think we have to talk together collectively. What is the future? Where do we have needs? Because that builds uncertainty. And for businesses who hate uncertainty, the best thing that you can do to resolve that is with data and information and sharing what those programs are. And I think that's an opportunity for us going forward. You know, Missy Vanderpool, and I'm going to be down taking a tour of this facility on Monday, made a quote about our multimodal forms of transportation and the payback that came along with it. First, we had a KPDI site that you all helped provide the pilot project funding for, and now Pratt Paper is located in Henderson, 341 jobs, $400 million investment, and it's all because of those accessibilities to multimodal forms of transportation and the investments that you all help make in having the kind of products to attract that type of an employer. I'm not going to go through this because Jeremy did a far better job than I could, but really understanding where we have our assets, where we have those lines is critically important. And I would just go back to, when you got a really good asset, let's first make sure we preserve it before we go out and build something anew. And I think that's one of the discussion points that you all thankfully have taken on relative to your body of work. Another slide that I think is important is understanding where we have good transport services, where we have rail, where we have air, and also where we have connectability into deep water ports throughout Kentucky, and how do we link in up to the northern areas of Canada. We've got that data, we've got that information, and candidly, folks, when we ever have a prospect in, again, as we had last evening, these are the kind of slides, these are the data points these companies are looking for in terms of the decision that they are going to make. No sense in going back through all of these, but again, we have good assets. We have a lot of things for us as a state of Kentucky, and you all have heard me say this before, but I believe strongly a lot of us in Kentucky need to quit taking humility pills and nice pills, and every now and then it's okay to brag about a lot of the things that we have that are advantageous to business, advantageous to commerce, and we have it here in Kentucky with these assets. Again, won't stack it up, but the question was, data points on air service, data points on rail, data points on water, all those things companies look at in terms of knowing where their optionalities are. Story that I worked on a project with Worthington Steel that they needed a spur line that ultimately they never really used, but they said we never will locate a facility where we don't have optionality relative to differing forms of transportation, because we don't want to be held hostage by any one carrier, any one form of transportation, because they move very high-valued, large items. That's kind of what I think we have in terms of all the assets that we have here in Kentucky. Understanding where we have a lot of operations today in terms of distribution and logistics, we have a lot of them. They're very dispersed throughout the state. My question is, we need to do a better job understanding, is there another mode they could take on with their current location? Are there areas that we could be working with them? I think that there's a lot of ways that information, that data can be useful as we think about where to go in this area into the future. I always like to look at things from a different perspective. This map's going to be eye candy and you probably can't see it, but on here is the investments that you all helped make working with the governor in our workforce training facilities across the state, where we have invested in new roads. I like to look at those. That's actually a part of multimodal forms of transportation, and that is, how do we build out that infrastructure, not just for businesses, not just for goods, but for investment in our people. And if you build roads and then build a new training facility, you're expanding the reach for the individual looking for employment after being trained, and you're expanding the reach for employers to hire that individual. It's just an interesting way of looking at it in eastern Kentucky, especially as we realize the Brent Spence Bridge, and I don't think any of us fully comprehend what a big impact, when that's done, is going to have on expanding our various modes of transportation and efficiency in multimodal forms of transportation going forward. Same thing in Western Kentucky, where we have investments, where we have new roads, where we have ports. We try to just find a way of looking at all those things as we look at our investments, talk to our companies, and understand those advantages that we have from an economic development perspective. I mentioned it, no point in belaboring it, but we do appreciate the confidence in the work of this body with our KBDI program, because I think, candidly, going forward, if that program is still around, there's more ways that we can leverage creating better industrial sites along with river ports, along with rail service, rail locations. We got lots of examples of it. And again, that's what companies are looking for in terms of their decision making. And that's what I've always said, that separates just a piece of dirt from a site that can really attract companies and help existing companies, is having all of those assets connected to or nearby where you're putting in a potential product for industrial and job creation development. Tying it all back together, where do we go from here? And timing, I think, is beneficial, and that's why we appreciate what you all are doing. We will be launching. We have gone through a search, and we'll be determining who the search consultant will be. But we think we really need to have a good look at strategy around economic development, especially in the changing landscapes, especially in the foundation of success that Kentucky has had with a lot of companies expanding and locating here. We want that study to really identify the top 10 things that economic developers can do, and also help identify what should be prioritization around multimodal forms of transportation. What are the kinds of companies that we can attract to help stimulate that growth in those areas? And we are excited that we'll be launching this strategic plan in partnership with the Kentucky Association of Economic Developers. But we've built a structure where we're going to be working with a lot of organizations, whether it's the area development districts, the Kentucky League of Cities, the Chamber, Kentucky Association of Manufacturers. All of them will be structurally inputting their views, their needs, and their information so that we summarize all that in our strategic plan to help guide us going forward, and we think this is a big part of that. In the end, multimodal really does drive all the things you need to create wealth and opportunity in Kentucky. I don't care if it's in entrepreneurialism, attracting companies, all of it links back in, and those will be a part of our strategy, linking to what we know is out there from decision points that need to be made around multimodal forms of transportation. So I'll end as we started, how much we appreciate the chance to work with this group. We appreciate the chance to work with good partners like the Transportation Cabinet, but we've got great core industries that depend upon multimodal forms of transportation. We know we need to be planning for it and always trying to stay one step ahead of what's happening, because when you look in the rearview mirror, things change. They always do. Our key is, I think, to stay ahead of those changes and to always make them an advantage for us. We've got great foreign direct investments here that rely on transportation. Let's plug them in, make sure that we have them. Let's also understand that good jobs, good workforce training, and helping work with dentists and community development, that's also a multimodal form of transportation to help move people, goods, services, and information that should be part of our overarching strategy as a state. I know you get bored and tired of it, but I always like to end with this because I do believe this is what we're all about. It's not about the jobs. It's not about anything. It's about making sure that we help people get access to those jobs, the training, so that their house becomes a home. And if that home becomes that stable form for their life, their families can dream bigger, do better, and in the end, we create better neighborhoods, better communities, and better people who all work to support one another when we have those good, stable jobs and stable communities. And multimodal transportation is a big anchor and a part of that. So I appreciate your patience. I know I went quickly, but I thought with knowing a few members on this body, there might be a few questions thrown our way. So we'll make sure you have the deck and any other information that you need. And Jeremy, again, thanks for being a leader in and making my job easier.
Katie and Matthew, would you like to say anything?
Jeff's got it.
I think he handled it very well. He covered it all very nicely.
Very good.
Katie and Matt, tell me what to say if you want to know the truth.
Coach Howe.
So you turned to me first, and he looked at me when he made the comment about questions.
Yes, he did.
Did we just triangulate on some weird level there?
It's good that we think alike and try to support one another.
You probably don't want to get caught into thinking like me sometime.
No, it'd be an honor to do that.
Secretary Noel, thank you and all everybody with you that helped bring this together. We know you have a lot on your plate. But we appreciate you coming. We needed you in transportation here first as we go and take a deep dive and go down some rabbit holes in this in subsequent meetings. I've got a couple of questions on this, some from my own personal questions, some I just think we need to build out some exposure knowledge on some of these issues. I know it's not your slide, but in Jeremy's slide, they talked about 59% of the new jobs in Kentucky since 2020 were businesses, with suggesting the opportunities and new markets and everything. Of all of your new business development, I'm not talking about existing or expansion in new business, how relevant are 3 Rs, especially the in my question, the river and the railroad? How much do they matter in what we've been doing to date for economic development?
First, you can't really use a broad brushstroke on all of that, but you can break it down in individuals, and I think we could actually do a cut on our analysis to help come back with that. I mean, we know that the metal companies need rail and they need Riverport service to be able to have the products and the input to do what they do, and they employ a lot of folks across the state. That's where then it begins getting the data the right way, because there's a lot of parts that require some of those stainless steel that comes from those producers, or some of that recycled steel that comes in, and they go into some of those parts, then get made to go into the automotive sector, the aerospace industry, you name it. And the question becomes, well, if what I call the beginning point of a major component of that supply chain relies upon rail and Riverport, then the rest of that supply chain does as well. So defining that interdependencies is a really critical factor of understanding that. Another element that I think takes data and looking at it in a way, and also putting yourself in the form of a procurement officer thinking for the company, or the logistics officer, because I know this to be a fact. When you lose one of those modes of transportation as a business or as a community, and it's gone, suddenly you come around and you might have been one who said, I don't need it, they can rip up that rail, we don't need that. Well, when it's gone and suddenly you're needing another form of transportation, or there's a COVID, you say, why didn't we have that asset back, because it makes a big difference for us? Or they say, ooh, we lost that Riverport service, and now I've lost my negotiating leverage that I need as it relates to rail and or truck. But I think we can find it, but I'd say some of the bigger producers have some dependencies on both rail and Riverport. But most importantly, I think our job is to understand where is the real specific need going forward, because I also think sometimes if we just try to cover and help everything and everybody, being everything for everybody, may not be the biggest payback. So we could look at that data, Senator Howell, and come back to you and do it less on a holistic, I think, and more on the individual project basis. I mean, we wouldn't have Pratt, we wouldn't have the North American Stainless, we wouldn't have the Novell, we wouldn't have the Logan Aluminums. Those are all projects that we have, and we've had several ag-related projects that we know depend upon the movement of both for grain, but also fertilizer and things coming in from those river ports. So we owe you a better information, Senator, and we'll work to do that for you.
Thank you. That might be helpful. You know, I grew up on a river. I've lived this, but a lot of our peers haven't, and we don't have a good understanding. It sounds good in concept. You know, if we could just see on a map where the new stuff was, and if anything's shown, obviously Pratt would be the prime example of that. But it might help all of us understand better what it means in real terms.
Yeah, I think what we'd like to do is coordinate with Jeremy and maybe with our consultant, because I think one of the places I'd like to start is work with our 10 river ports and try to get a better understanding from them who they're servicing, who their customers are, and then we'll do an overlay also with some of the big projects that we know rail and Riverport were critical. I'm not smart enough to answer my own question, so I'm going to ask my question aloud and then show you how naive I am. Some way there's got to be an algorithm and a way of actually calculating these interdependencies that I've been talking about. Multimodal is named multimodal for a reason, and using more than one form of transportation is really, I think, the real thing that's happening. And I think better understanding that is one of the things we have to do, and then trying to extrapolate what are those interdependencies. Can you do an algorithm to actually measure that importance? Because I believe with everything I've got in the world today, losing some of those forms of transportation, especially in rail and Riverport, you'll come back and wish that you had them. And I got some personal experience with Whirlpool in certain countries where you have really great access to all of those areas. Your logistics costs are usually lower, your reliability is higher, and if you will, what I call the overhead costs, whether it's shrinkage, security issues, you name it, go up when you actually have forms of multimodal types of transportation. So we'll try to get that, but that's a question that I have because I think that's an important element of our decision-making process.
And hopefully we'll be able to supply more of that information about the river ports as we go forward. A lot of the questions, the answers may actually be in the comprehensive plan that you had referenced. And I was glad to see you do that as we go into especially in the Riverport arena. A lot of this has been evolutionary as a need or an opportunity presented itself. That particular area would jump into that game, but there doesn't seem to have been a lot of comprehensive planning on this, and I think that's one of the things that we've missed. As you talk to different companies that are looking at expanding here, that are present companies are locating here, does anything ever come up with our 3 Rs about if you had this, we would be more interested in you as a location? Do you recall any of that? I know you hadn't been on the job that long, but have been long enough to
13
have
months.
seen some.
I'm an old hand at this.
Time flies when you're having fun,
Yeah.
doesn't it? But does that ever come up in some of your discussions, or are the businesses already so educated at that point that there's no need to bring it up with you?
No, I haven't come out of the business side. They're never that educated. They need that information. I'm going to break it down this way. Even if you've got Riverport Rail and you've got a site you're trying to pitch them on, if they don't have better connectability to be able to make sure that things move seamlessly from wherever it's being shipped from to where they're doing production, and they actually have to, in some cases, go to a transport station, load everything off of what had been on a river barge, maybe it moved in a short line rail, and they still have to move it by truck. Well, suddenly that's what really causes the issue. So they get excited, but then they still need to see that full serviceability that's there. And I know we've got some short rail line folks here. They are really fantastic to work with. They're an important part of this. Also, I think sometimes the types of servicing that public river ports can provide is critically important. But I don't think that we've had anything where we messed out on all the various multimodal forms to be able to be in competition with some of these projects, because we do have really good multimodal forms of transportation. It just gets down to the very granular levels of what that particular company might need. I'm also going to throw out a provocative thought there too, and I think our job is to not only understand our private river ports, better understand maybe where we've got shared river port opportunities with adjacent states on the same waterway, to figure out how do you leverage that, and then translate that into really getting better data from some of our existing companies about how often they use this, where do they use it, what's the price point they would be willing to continue to go with it. So we'll get that for you. Now, biased, I got to work on the North American Stainless project years ago when they weren't located in Carrollton, and I can tell you from the very first meeting, had we not had sites that had access to a river port along with access to rail, that is an example of a project that we would not have had. And they employ 20-something hundred people, very high wages. And so we know we have lots of companies out there that would not have been here if it were not for the 3 Rs, as you call it, but I add in the other modes because I think that's just as important for some of these companies as well. So I think we just have to look at it. I don't think there's a silver bullet that we're missing. I think it's more a matter of, do we have all the things that we purport to have, and can they be efficient enough to take and service the kinds of companies that we have? And I go back to, I first like to make sure I take care of our assets. We have really good assets, but let's be smart about what we have, what we need, and maybe where there's some opportunities to leverage some growth in those spaces.
The plan that you've been talking about, you kind of touched on this, and I may have missed it. Is it study and integration of our various modes of transportation to kind of identify where we're weak or where we're particularly strong in any area?
Yeah, it's intended to. I don't know how deep we're going to get from our agreement, but our plan is to make sure that our 9 public river ports and the Department of Transportation does as deep a dive as we can in the river port. And then I'm going to take a step back and be very transparent. I think we also need to take a step back, and whether it's our study, whether it's Department of Transportation, we can do, and I think get some good information on rail from our service providers about how well are we doing, what's the realities of what's being there done. But I think the third leg that this study will be really focused on is what are the kinds of companies and targeted industries that we know if we grow or attract in will be better able to utilize our existing assets to the point in which we're getting the full value from them. I know there will be a lot of focus in that particular area.
We've kind of talked around this. I should ask this question first, I think. On slide 14, you talk about the reality check with optionality. Can you just kind of go in, for those that aren't in this space much, can you kind of explain that a little bit? Not to put you on the spot too much, we're not going to grade you or anything like that, but anything you explain is going to be better than what most of us are going to deal with.
No, I doubt that. My mother was an English teacher, and she told me that I was her worst student. I'm going to do the best I can. The optionality for me is kind of that Worthington Steel example, or it's an example with any other company. If you only have one mode or two that's going to be your transport items of bringing in recycled stainless or bringing in certain kinds of chemicals that you need to create your compounding to do the work that you have to do, and you've only got those one or two modes, those service providers know that. And let's say that you're spending 30, 40, 50 million, $100 million a year, which is not uncommon for some of those raw items to be moved in and provided to your operation. Well, suddenly you're susceptible to a few cents per mile or other kinds of negotiations because you don't have that optionality necessary to be able to basically make sure you're getting the best price. Optionality is the best way in which we can show to a company, regardless of which mode, and or if they want to use the multimodal forms of transportation, that optionality means we are more efficient, you can negotiate better pricing, and you're not held hostage to, and I know that's a terrible term, but you're not held to just one or two of those service providers. And that's a part of the equation I think we have to look at very smartly in terms of if and where we make some of these investments. I'm also going to go back to Representative Smith's comments. I don't have the magic wand. I know that in my previous life, we worked really hard on some multi-modes of transportation to work with Customs and Immigration to see if we could set up either a what I call an annex post or direct post for Customs officials to be on site. Because there are certain companies that don't want all their items to come through the Savannah River Port or Savannah Port because they get bogged down. There's a lot of things that slow down. If we could have that in one of our rail service areas or one of our river port areas and really have good, and I don't know what we currently have, but I know that if we could improve that, that's another optionality that we would have that would provide more business to truckers, to rail, if we and other forms of transportation if you've got that kind of optionality out there in the equation. I'm not saying go and invest in it. I'm simply saying we ought to look at it and understand how that might work and how important is that relative to the efficiencies with our businesses. I know we can run a swag on this, but we overlook, in answer to your question, we overlook how much cost and how much investment most businesses, it can be a small mom and pop, it can be a large multi-conglomerate, but their products that they have to bring in to then make their finished product and then what it costs to ship that product out. That next to workforce is their biggest investment oftentimes. Those multimodal forms of transportation are what gives Kentucky an efficiency play in that space to help support existing as well as new companies. So getting the answers to your question, Senator, are important, and that's what I meant by optionality, and I hope I answered it. If I didn't, I'll try again.
As one son of an English teacher to another, I appreciate the depth of your answer.
Thank you. And the length of it. I apologize for talking too much.
That's all I have.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of things, if you don't mind, to kind of catch up on as this being our first meeting and getting this thing on the ground floor to start building from. And maybe you can clarify maybe if my vision's too big. But in looking at the federal dollars coming down through the infrastructure funding, a lot of it dealing with supply chain issues. You're aware of a lot more than I am of how these dollars will be sent down to states. But we found one pot that you mentioned in the House Bill 9 that we'll be able to do through the energy counties that's lost funding. But as a state as a whole, one of the ideas that, and I had a little bit of discussion on in my area, was on the rail issue with CSX leaving. We have a large site there that's empty. And so a lot of this was derived by opportunity of looking at a multi-use site there as a rail site, using it as a distribution area. And so my challenge, I guess, to the other members on the committee, and maybe I'm a little further ahead on looking at the funding, looking at what we can do in my area. My challenge to them is to look at the ports and look at a big picture, because our opportunity is a window with federal dollars that in the shape that the legislature has gotten our state in with our reserves, because a lot of it's matching, maybe 80-20 type grants. But my challenge is, let's look at a big picture and then bring it down. But we do have a window that we have to be ready for, and it's now. We need to start looking at our applications, looking at our projects, identify them, narrow them down to 2 or 3 or 4, whatever it is across the state, and go after the funding. Because if we keep talking about and having meetings about it, other states right now are probably ahead of us on going after those funds. So I didn't want to look at it as a selfish saying, because I feel like my project I can do without this. I can make it happen, because I'm blessed with a strong congressman. I'm blessed with good leadership in the area that would go after it. But I think as a state as a whole, I think our ports, in listening to a committee meeting we had in transportation, we had a company here, I think we were talking about $5 million to invest in one of our ports to try to help the situation. Well, I asked him, I said, well, how much can you use? And he said, as much as you can build. And this was a company saying, we're willing to come if you've got the access. And I go to Jacksonville a couple times a year, and I mean, if you've ever been there, the port there is humongous. There's cranes everywhere. And so maybe am I looking at too big of a picture here? Is it a pipe dream, or is there reality there that we can look at $100 million investment in a port, $50 million, a $25 million investment in Eastern Kentucky in one of the airports to use it as freight? Where the customs came in was, the discussion that we've had over the last year. It's reality. If you can get a customs office into an area and you've got a business that can utilize it, you're going to have a creation of jobs and access. And so that's where that's come from. And you know the story behind it, but we need those customs in there because it helps us with the supply chain and getting it out of here and overseas, and without having to go to the ports in Florida or California or Louisiana. We can do that. We can be the transit. We can be the as you say, the reality check is, how far can we go? I'm looking at big picture, and I'm hoping that that's what we derive from this. And I'm not selfish. Let it happen in Western Kentucky. Let it happen at another airport. I just want to see it happen in Kentucky while the dollars are available. And any of the thing that I've said, the reason I'm saying this is I want you to kind of come back and say, is the picture too big? Do we need to narrow the scope? What do we need to derive from this? Because we've got 5 months to come with a proposal. What can we do as a committee, as a task force, to make something happen from this, to be reality, and to accomplish a large goal? Is that fair to ask?
It's fair to ask, and first of all, we all need to dream. We all need to look to the big picture, because if we don't, we'll miss something. Now, all that said, I think data is what drives determining what really is reasonable and what's feasible. And then after you really identify that, then you go after those grant funds. I mean, just trying to go after the funding, I think, might be a mistake, but I think really identifying what the plan would be. And you actually referenced the most important leg of the stool. We've got to have your all's leadership. We have to understand, the natural assets that we have. We got to have an understanding of what type of funding might be available. But I really think to have those real big visions become a reality, We really, truly need input from businesses to understand, is it feasible and is it reality? And I'll be the first to tell you, I'm not that smart to be able to sit and tell you, is it workable or is it not? I'm not even so sure I know how to go out and get that information and to do it as quickly as you're asking, because to be perfectly humble about it, there's only so much of what we can do. I believe that we do need to work collaboratively, try to identify where those opportunities could be, and really go out and talk to some of those businesses. I believe a great place to start is some conversations with the private operators. I mean, down in Owensboro Grain, you talk about them, you talk about North American Stainless. I think understanding all of that would be helpful. And then understanding what kind of ancillary air freight, my goodness, we're the second most, we lead the country except for Tennessee in volume and tonnage. Well, we should be talking to DHL and UPS. Is that a reality? Is that something that would work? Because if we can't start there with them and get a vision of what they would have, I don't think we're going to be able to go out and get FedEx to come in and do it without something like that. So I do believe that leg of the stool of including businesses, including the current operators, is an important step. And then I really truly believe we shouldn't hold ourselves back for what the vision could be, but we should temper it around what we do learn and what those opportunities are, and then we shape our efforts to try and apply for federal grants, et cetera, based around those really solid, good working plans. But time is short, resources are short, prioritization and figuring out where we go try to put those energies, I think, is a critical factor. I hope that's my answer that I best can provide today.
Any other questions of the members? I do have one question for you. Do you have a deadline on your study? Do we have a time period that we can expect that?
Studies do take a while. We're doing it right. It should be available sometime in November, December.
Well, I believe you've answered all their questions, which is wonderful. I do know that the last time that Katie and I were at Pratt for the groundbreaking was the hottest day of that year, I believe. So I anticipate your visit to Henderson being equally as warm next week, and visit your in-laws while you're down there, if you don't mind, in Union County along the way.
That's part of the plan, and 28 years in Michigan, I haven't had a hot day that's been too hot in Kentucky yet, and I look forward to what it's going to be. And let me close with what I said. We really do appreciate the work of this body. We appreciate your taking on a really important big topic, and I think it's going to require all of us collaborating to do it in the right way, in the right order, and really understanding how do we build in those metrics and understanding so that we can identify if and then when, where to go put our energies and resources. But there's opportunities, and from my vantage point, again, I don't know what is more important of our forms of transportation. I just know we're blessed to have multimodal forms of transportation, and they play a critical factor. And when you lose balance in any part of the equation, that's usually where you have those unintended consequences. And understanding that's an important part, I think, of our collective work.
Thank you. Thank you all for both the groups presenting today. Co-Chair Howell, do you have anything else?
Nothing, Madam Chairman. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, thank all of you all for attention and attendance today. We do have a quick turnaround for our next meeting. It is August the 1st at 3 p.m. So just a reminder of that meeting is coming around quickly, and Co-Chair Howell will be the chair of that one. And safe travels. If there is nothing further, then we are adjourned.